Good day, everyone. I am Mr. Neil Michael G. Olivar, your instructor for this course, Assessment in Learning 2. So I welcome you with sincere heart to my class. Okay, by the way, Assessment in Learning 2 has a prerequisite subject, and it is Assessment in Learning 1. And since you are enrolled to my subject, I assume that you already have taken up the prerequisite subject and that you already have a little background about assessment. So what is here in Assessment of Learning 2? So inaaning Assessment in Learning 2. So in Assessment in Learning 2, you will deepen your understanding about assessment because we will be talking here about the foundations of assessment. Foundations include mga theories and concept about assessment. Also, we will dig deeper about alternative ways of assessing your students' outcome, mga modern approaches of assessment. And last but not the least is, in this course, you will learn how to analyze and to report assessment data. In other words, you will learn how to compute grades and how to assign grades to each of your students. So before we start, I'd like to show you the book that we will be using for the entire semester. This book is available in the library and I hope that you will grab a copy of yours aning a book para well guided ta along the way, along the semester. So, as your instructor, I will be delivering to you the first topic. The first topic is about basic concepts, theories, and principles in assessing learning using alternative methods. So this topic is very important to you, pre-service teachers. Yes, consider yourselves as pre-service teachers because you are not yet teaching in the field and that you have not yet finished the education course. So mga pre-service teachers mo. Pero despite of that, still importante gihapon na you will learn how to give assessment to your students, how to, give appropriate and kanang relevant type of assessment sa inyong mga bata. So fasten your seatbelt as I will discuss the first lesson. Ready? So at the end of this video lesson, you're going to define and explain alternative assessment and related concepts and demonstrate an understanding of the different principles in assessing learning using alternative methods of assessment. So what is assessment? How do we define assessment? Assessment is the process of gathering quantitative and or qualitative data for the purpose of making decisions. So I'd like to stress the phrase process of gathering quantitative and or qualitative data. So assessment is an act of which teachers has to gather data. It's either quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative has something to do with figures, mga numbers. Qualitative, it's more on descriptive values like always, sometimes, most of the time. So these data are used by the teacher in order to make decision. So example, teacher Anna delivers a lesson. So at the end of the discussion, Teacher Anna wants to check whether her students have understood the topic or not. So Teacher Anna has to give a test. And that particular test is considered assessment. Now at the end of the test, Teacher Anna found out that majority of the students got a low score. So what should Teacher Anna do? Of course, Teacher Anna has to reteach the lesson. So that decision of reteaching the lesson is done by Teacher Anna because of the results she got from the assessment. So therefore, assessment is used by teachers in order to make informed decision. So what is assessment of learning? Assessment of learning is a systematic and purpose-oriented collection, analysis, and interpretation of evidence of student learning in order to make informed decisions relevant to the learners. Okay, please take note of the word of, the preposition of. So assessment, ganina, we define it as process of gathering data. So assessment of learning, so meaning to say, this is a type of assessment that really measures the amount of learnings the student got at the end of a particular period. So assessment of learning. Ang gi-assess ang learning sa mga bata. Meaning the purpose of giving this particular assessment is to assess the amount of learning um, acquired by the students at the end of a particular period or quarter. So, of course, the results taken from assessment of learning would serve as the evidence of students' learning. Hato ba, kung pilay score sa bata from that assessment of learning, that will represent him as students. That will represent the amount of learning he got from the series of discussions. Unya, syempre, kay evidence man siya, so the results of this assessment of learning will serve as the grades. Will be the one of the bases of the gradings of the students. So example of assessment of learning is the summative test. So at the end of a particular week of discussion, in a Friday, the teacher gives a test, and that particular test is considered an act of assessing the student's learning. So assessment of learning na siya. So the scores are graded and recorded. Okay, gi-record siya at the same time, basihan po siya sa grado sa bata. So, another is assessment for learning. Is formative in nature and is meant to identify gaps in the learning experiences of students so they can be assisted in achieving the curriculum outcomes. So, let us compare and contrast. Ganina, of ang gigamit na preposition. Karon, the preposition used is for. So, for siya, meaning to say, the purpose of giving this particular assessment is for the students to learn more. So it's formative by nature. So kuan siya kanang sintawan ang purpose niya is para mas makatun pa ang bata for the students to learn more. Take for example, discuss ko. I'm discussing something. And then in the middle of the discussion, I throw a question to the students to check whether the students have understood the topic or not. So pag ask na ko sa question, that's a form of assessment for learning. Meaning, I'm checking whether the students have learned what I say or not. So kung di sila makatubag, then I will repeat my discussion. I will rephrase my discussion. So the purpose of that is for the students to learn more. So the scores the students got from assessment for learning is recorded but not graded. Ano man, hindi man siya graded because it's not a representation of the students learning. Di man siya mag-represent sa amount of learning sa bata. Nga naman, kay kining assessment for learning, imo ra man siyang ihatag at the end of every lesson, dili at the end of every quarter or at the end of every unit. So assessment for learning, example niya is the formative test or the formative assessment. Ganina, ang sample sa assessment of learning was the summative test. So from the word summative, it summarizes a particular cluster of topics. So gi-measure nimo ang cluster of topics. So that's assessment of learning. Karon for learning man. So ang purpose ani niya is para lang gyud mas makat-on ang bata for learning. Then, traditional assessment, the use of traditional assessment strategies. Student learning, it could be objective or subjective. So, from the word traditional assessment, so it's the use of the paper and pencil test. So, kinalaan nga way of assessing the students' learning. Okay, by the way, ganina, I have made mention that the purpose of assessment of learning is to measure the amount of learning. Kining assessment for learning is, ang iyang purpose is for the students to learn more and for the teacher to modify his or her instructions, his or her style. Okay? Kita kasi teacher na, oy, huwag ko kasabot huwag kasabot ang mga bata sa lessons. So, might as well, I have to change my strategy. So, what is meant by alternative assessment? Alternative assessment is the use of alternative or non-traditional assessment strategies or tools to collect information on student learning. So in other words, alternative assessment is the modern style of assessing the student's learning outcome. So examples of alternative assessment, we have performance-oriented assessment. So from the word itself, performance-oriented, meaning in this type of assessment, the teacher focuses more on the actual performance of the students, on how the student performs a particular task, how a student demonstrates a particular skill. Muna siya performance-oriented assessment. Example, a PE teacher. A PE teacher teaches the basic of cha-cha. Of course, how can the teacher assess whether the students have learned the basic of cha-cha? Of course, the teacher has to let the students perform the basic dance steps. Okay? So another is product-oriented assessment. So in this particular type of alternative assessment, the teacher focuses on the outputs, the tangible outputs of the students. Example, um, a home economics teacher teaches how to stitch. So of course, the output of the students will be rated as to how clean, how beautiful, how how expert the students do the stitching. Na yung product oriented assessment. Here are the features of alternative assessment, the attributes or characteristics of alternative assessment, according to Silvestre-Tipay 2009. So assessment is based on authentic tasks that demonstrates learners' ability to accomplish communication goals. So a particular assessment can only be called alternative assessment if it seeks to demonstrate learners' ability. So if in that particular assessment the students demonstrate something, then that particular assessment can be considered as alternative type of assessment. Second, instructor and learners focus on communication, not on right and wrong answers. So since this particular alternative assessment, do away from traditional paper and pencil test. So the focus of this type of assessment is really communication between the teacher and the students. Because if there is an established communication, kanang continuous communication between the students and the learners, of course, there is a continuous learning. Ano man, the teacher coaches, the students learn. The students ask question, the teacher answers the question. So there is a communication between the student and the teacher. Learners help set the criteria for successful completion of communication tasks. Okay, by the way, in the alternative type of assessment, the teacher uses rubrics. And of course, rubrics have criteria. Now, the criteria should never come from teacher alone. So criteria should be coming from the agreement between the teacher and the students. Because if the teacher gives the criteria na siya ra alone, of course, the teacher here is teacher-centered, not children-centered or learner-centered. The teacher has to consult, has to seek opinions, has to seek suggestions from the students. And since the students have given the criteria, of course, sila may nakata sa criteria, so they would make sure that they would do their best to achieve the criteria, to come up with a good grades. Kaya sila gid mismo ang naghatag sa criteria, so there's no reason for them not to achieve the criteria. Another, learners have opportunities to assess themselves and their peers. So, one characteristic of alternative assessment is that learners are able to assess themselves and assess also the performance of their classmates. So, how to do this? It could be in a form of mga checklist where Group A will rate Group B's performance and Group B will rate Group A's performance. So in that manner of arrangement, the teacher gives opportunities for students to assess their peers. Yan po yung mga instances nga ang bata po mo rate sa ilang kagalingon nga output. That's assessing themselves. So other alternative methods of assessing learning. So we have performance assessment. So this type of assessment focuses on the performance of the students, meaning the teacher's way of assessing the students' learning is through performance. Performance-based assessment is yeah. So example ani is the teacher is teaching ESP, edukasyon sa pagpapakatao, and then she teaches more on the value of honesty. So how can the teacher assess whether the students have learned the value of honesty? So it could be in a form of role play or drama. So that's one example of performance assessment. So the students have to make a script and then they will act the script to show the value of honesty. Another is portfolio assessment. So in this type of assessment, the teacher requires the students to have portfolio. So portfolio is a collection of students' outputs throughout a particular period of time. So kanang mga outputs sa mga bata ipangbutang sa envelope, labeled na siya, arranged na siya chronologically to show whether there is an improvement of the students' performance in the classroom. That's one example of portfolio assessment. So portfolio, daha klase ang portfolio. It could be display portfolio, developmental portfolio. Anyway, we will dig deeper about portfolio assessment in the proceeding topics pohon. So the use of rubrics. So rubrics have this criteria for judging. So actually, kining rubrics, it's the guide of the teachers on how to rate the students. So through the use of rubrics, being biased is being avoided also. So the teacher will rate the students' output according to the predetermined criteria that are agreed upon between the teacher and the students. So the use of checklist. Checklist is very understandable and very common. So the use of checklist also can be considered as alternative methods of assessing learning. Why? Because through checklist, the students may be able to assess the performance or the learning of their peers and also themselves. Models of alternative assessment. First model is emergent assessment. This focuses on determining the effects of instruction on students. It's more on gathering qualitative data through direct and indirect observation. So take note of the word qualitative data. So the data gathered by the teacher through direct or indirect observation is through narrative. Okay, data man siya. So this model is more likely applicable to values education. So example, the teacher wants to rate the students as to honesty. How students demonstrate honesty. So direct observation siya if the teacher actually sees how the student behaves, how the students demonstrate honesty. That's direct observation. So indirect observation, if the teacher only gets the information from the students or from the classmates or from the parents of that particular students, he would like to rate. So, na siya indirect observation. Sa ato pa, ang direct observation, teacher mismo kita sa bata. Naka-observe siya sa bata. Indirect, base lang siya sa data ng gihatag sa mga classmates o sa parents. Kamantay mo anang sa card. Di ba before, sa mga progress report card, nasa likod na narratives diha, how students behave. So, kana siya are direct observation of the teacher from particular students or to a particular student. Developmental assessment focuses on determining the extent that students have developed their competencies from instruction. By the way, competencies are clusters of skills or objectives, mga nagtapundog ng mga topics. Mga clusters of topics. So, developmental assessment is done if the teacher gives pre-test prior to discussion and post-test after the discussion. So the teacher compares the results sa pre-test o sa post-test. Is there any progress? Is there any improvement? That's one example of developmental assessment. The last model is the authentic assessment, the use of assessment strategies or tools that allow learners to perform or create a product that is meaningful to the learners as they are based on real world context. So authentic assessment DI is a type of assessment wherein the teacher gives a task that is really happening in the community or that is really happening in the real world scenario or real world situations. When I say authentic assessment, for example, when you are teaching math, sa grade 1 kintahay, simple addition, one digit addition, one digit addition. So, di ka madiretso nga 2 plus 2, 4 ang answer sa mga bata. Pwede in a form of word problem. Example, si Ana gisugo sa iyang mama, Bisaya lang kay grade 1 man, di ba? Si Ana gisugo og suka sa iyahang mama, balik 5 og balik 5 mga asin. Pila tanan ang mabayad ni Ana. That's real world context, real life problem. Nga naman, it happens. It happens na ang bata sugon gid sa iyang mama nga patug suka or asin. Criteria of an authentic assessment. Be built around topics or issues of interest to the students. Remember, we are student-centered, so our top priority is to make sure that our assessment is really of interest to the students. Another is replicate real-world communication context and situation. Meaning, your authentic assessment should be genuine. It should be real life. Another, involve multi-stage tasks and real problems that require creative use of language rather than simple repetition. So dapat ang imong assessment, it triggers creative thinking skills of the students. It's not about just kanagaling mga fill in the blanks, kanang mga true or false, kay mga identification, because those are simple repetition. Students are not required to think. So instead of having that traditional way of assessing students, you have to make sure that we use authentic assessment, mga questions that are real life and that provoke thinking, creative thinking among our students. Another, require learners to produce a quality product or performance. Same ganiha, katong product-oriented or performance-oriented. Then introduce the students to the evaluation criteria and standards. The one I said earlier, that we should make sure that we let our students know the criteria and standards of grading. Ano naman, so they are guided. Kay bawo sila, usa nga criterion ang bugat-bugat og weight. So adto ta mo ang costume kay 5% naman siya, di lang ka kayo ana. So that's the importance of telling them the criteria for judging. Then involve the interaction between assessor and the person assessed. Okay, there should always be a communication between the assessor, the teacher, and the person assessed or the students. Kaya nga naman, kung wala communication between the teacher and the students, meaning, wala learning. Ano naman, ang bata, mao manungutanan ni teacher for follow-up. Diba? There should be communication between them. Then, allow for self-evaluation and self-correction as they proceed. So, self-evaluation and self-corrections. Make them realize, in the middle of the assessment procedure, authentic assessment will let the students realize their own mistakes. So, it's not you, the teacher, who will tell them what's wrong. It should be them who will discover what went wrong and what went right. Okay? So different principles in assessing learning using alternative methods. Assessment is both process and product oriented. It's very understandable. Assessment should focus on higher order cognitive outcomes. So kining higher order cognitive outcomes have something to do with katong sa Bloom's taxonomy na di lang ta simple recall. Assessment can include a measure of non-cognitive learning outcomes. Then, assessment should reflect real life or real world context. Assessment must be comprehensive and holistic, meaning it does not only measure one form of intelligence. If possible, you tap all the multiple intelligences of your students nga magamit din nila. Then last is assessment should lead to student learning. This is the very important principle of assessment. It should lead to student learning. We give them assessment for them to learn more. So, for your first activity, in a short size of bond paper, answer the activity marked apply on pages 8 to 9 of this book. Nadi rin na siya page 8 to 9, nadi ang apply nga portion. You may refer from the given example on page 8. So sa page 8, may makita itong example on how to answer the activity. Since this task is based on personal experience, I am expecting of an original and unique answers from each of you. Take note hagi, dako na diha ng original o unique. So don't copy from your classmates. Katong parehong answer, you will suffer the consequence. Bitaw. So for uniformity, please observe the following format. It's a matter of reading. So thank you and I hope that you learned something from me today. Bye. See you in the next topic.